Okay, hello everyone. This is our sixth podcast with Professor Emeritus Horst Hutter from Concordia University, who today will be discussing Eros and Gnosticism. Horst, you may commence.
Okay, now my theme today is the strong element of Gnosticism in the evolution of erotic regimes uh, associated with the monotheistic religions, or shall we say that afflicted the monotheistic religions since the spirit of late antiquity. I am particularly emphasizing Christianity, although what I have to say also concerns Islam and Judaism, all three monotheistic cults. In order to hit the nail really well on the head, I'd like to to begin with the quote of Nietzsche, who in the Beyond Good and Evil, in an aphorism says, Christianity gave Eros poison to drink. He did not die from it, but he did degenerate into a vice. And I think with this, Nietzsche is indicating the strong Gnostic element associated with the development of erotic regimes, especially in Christianity, from which he himself suffered. Now, Gnosticism is derived from the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge. And it concerns the knowledge of the human condition that is associated with the fundamental affect, the fundamental compulsion of the human soul, that is Eros. In order to fully understand it, I think we need to go back to pre-Christian, pre-monotheistic uh, cultures. By that I mean the tragic culture of ancient Greece. Uh, Tragic, and the word tragedy itself in Greek means uh, goat song, and tragic culture is based on the assumption that the human condition is best characterized uh, to be very deeply tragical. That is, we are all singing goats, uh, as little in control of what happens to us, uh, what motivates us, how we shape our lives as are goats. So we are all singing goats. Now, one of the main compulsions of these singing goats, that which makes them sing the most, is erotic desire. Now, erotic desire was considered very ambiguously in tragic culture of late antiquity. I'd like to quote here two phrases. One is from Sophocles' Antigone, a play, a tragic play that concerns very much one of the main dangers of erotic civilization of Eros, and that is the uh, possibility of having erotic attraction between members of the close family. Antigone is a daughter uh, who is afflicted with erotic regime, uh, erotic desire for her father, who is afflicted with erotic desire for her mother and her at the same time. Now, at one point, Sophocles, the author of the play, writes in the chorus, has the chorus recite, uh, Eros, Eros, anikate machan. Eros, you are completely undefeatable in fighting. So that means that no one is above erotic desire. Everybody is afflicted by it. Everybody is driven by it. This way, we are all in the search. It's both a search and a pull. Similarly, another quote is by Sappho of Lesbos, a priestess of Lesbos, the island of Lesbos, uh, who said that Eros is sweet and bitter, is the sweet of the bitterness. And in Greek, Eros glykupikron, which has become the title of a very recent great book by a Canadian author, Anne Carson, Eros the Bittersweet, one of the very beautiful books written in academic book writing recently. So Eros is both sweet, it attracts us, that's why we like it, we cannot avoid it, but it is also bitter. A consequence of this is that there is no such thing as a human life without suffering, without an inner compulsion that causes that suffering. Now, the great philosophers of antiquity, Plato, Aristotle, Epicurus, all of them were deeply aware of this and were deeply aware of the erotic nature of the human condition and were trying to find ways of life, political orders that would reduce the human suffering. Now, one thing that happened at the end of antiquity, the last 2 to 3 centuries before the rise of Christianity, that there were enormous wars in the Mediterranean area and huge amounts of suffering. Lots of enslavements, invasions, murders, etc., all of which coincided with the rise of the monotheistic religions. Now, the monotheists claimed, or some of them claimed, that they understood, they knew why there was the suffering. So from the Gnostic perspective, there are 2 questions that have to be answered. One is, why is there so much suffering? How can we reduce suffering? Secondly, why is there so much evil? Because very much of suffering is inflicted by human beings on other human beings. Why are human beings so evil? Why is the world constructed in such a way as to permit such enormous suffering? This is particularly poignant in a monotheistic religion because the monotheistic God is supposed to be all good and all powerful. Being all good and all powerful, why has he created such a lousy world? And one of so the Gnostics then tried to find an answer to this question. And there were basically 2 solutions to that question. One was, even though the world is created by a good God, the good God had a helper called Satan. And this helper was either very evil and then messed it all up, or a lesser version of Gnosticism is he was confused. So the good God is creating the world, but he has to rely on executing what he wants to be done by a helper who is not at the level of understanding that is necessary. So there are either 2 gods. So the idea was that there a duotheistic conception, or a conception of a monotheistic with a deficient helper. Now, this and all of this centered on Eros, because the suffering and the cruelty would not exist were it not for erotic desire. That is, human beings have to be reproduced, have to be created in order to suffer. So the question then becomes, so the erotic regimes then, the erotic teaching then centers around how can we reduce that suffering? Well, obviously, if human beings are not born, they don't suffer. So one of the main impetuses of the Gnostic regimes is then reduce erotic desire to the point where there is no reproduction. There were certain Gnostic cults that completely rejected any kind of erotic intercourse, any kind of sexuality, complete denial of the eros, in order to for not to produce. When somebody then would ask these groups, and this was at the time of St. Paul and the rise of Christianity, when somebody would ask the leaders of these groups, well, if you do that, you will all die out, they would answer, well, the sooner the better. And the other one was to reduce erotic desire, to contain it in such a way. And this is where then the Christian regime of erotic desire comes in. That is the other version then of curtailing eros was to perform it in such a lavish manner that you got sick of it. That is orgies. There were Christian orgies that were such that everybody was okay. It's okay, but let's not do it anymore. It's disgusting. It is it's boring and disgusting, right? So these were the two Gnostic movements that arose at the time, and divisions of the now the church, the main leaders of the church, of course, didn't accept either complete abstinence, because that would mean dying out, nor did they accept the kind of erotic regime which was orgies, Christian orgies. Now, it is very interesting that the Greek language, the New Testament was written in Greek. It is peculiar that the word eros does not occur once in the Greek New Testament. It is as if the word had disappeared from the Greek language, which it hadn't, because Plotinus and Porphyry and others use it at the time. And it was used in the Platonic Academy. And it was used in the library of Nakhim Hammadi that was recently found in the desert in Egypt, which has an erotic regime, erotic gospels, etc. Gnostic erotic gospels. Now, nevertheless, it is peculiar. It proves that there was something then, for example, in St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians, which talks about the family and family love and mother and father and creating children, marriage, etc. The word eros does not occur. It is if they did not have erotic desires. The word philia, friendship, occurs. The word storge occurs. The Greek word for love, the Greek had 4 words for love, but eros was not one of those words. Now, so this is then the erotic regime, the understanding of eros that became part of the whole evolution of Christianity up to the modern times. It has evolved, but it is now dissolving because the modern, the Christian religion as well as the Islamic religion and Judaism are undergoing nihilistic dissolution. As an example of the repression of eros that was initiated by the Gnostic regimes, we have one of the most repressive regimes is Islam in Saudi Arabia. I remember reading in the German magazine Der Stern, there was a Saudi princess recently in the 1960s or 70s, when there was the erotic enlightenment in the West. And this Saudi princess was taking piano lessons from a commoner. And at one point, they were caught kissing each other. which was then punished terribly. He was beheaded and she was publicly whipped. Similarly, a girl had a sick father and was taking him to the in a taxi alone with a taxi chauffeur. She was taking her father to the hospital because he had a crisis, and the morality police arrested them, found her singly in the cab, and then she was sentenced to be publicly whipped. But the king of Saudi Arabia pardoned her. I'm mentioning this just to show what kind of erotic regime was established by the monotheistic cults many, many centuries ago. And similarly with Christianity. That is, the Christian religion is filled with repressive erotics, with disgusting practices that were imposed upon. That is, the idea was to impose an erotic regime that is totally controlled. That is, the only way is Eros is in marriage and no other place, and then it is to be only in a manner of both parties go to the wedding as virgins, and then they have no other desire anymore. But this, of course, means that that it is not possible, because you cannot restrain. And there are sources in Christianity that point out that Eros cannot be contained. Right? And this is now one of the best sources for this is the Platonic understanding of erotics. Plato accepts Eros as procreation. The Platonic definition of Eros from the dialogue, the Symposium, is Eros is the mortal creature's desire to attain immortality by begetting upon the beautiful. One way of begetting is procreating children, but there are many other ways of begetting, that is writing books, creating works of art, etc. Now, what we are confronted with now, today, is a dissolution of the Christian moral order. And we have, for example, in the 1960s, we had the great liberation of what in French is called les 68 the 68ers. The great liberation, the great erotic liberation, which is still going on, right? Of course, it will take time. And now there are all kinds of movements afoot that try to find an sociological and ontological justification for erotic liberation. The person that comes to my mind is Margaret Mead, with her famous book called Coming of Age in Samoa. Margaret Mead was a famous anthropologist, and she studied the Samoan culture before it became Christian. And she pointed out that there was an erotic education among teenagers in that culture that did not make Eros sinful. The way the Catholic Church, for example, imposes and tries to control Eros is to link it to sinfulness. Right? Now, in Samoa, teenage girls and boys would have frequent contact, erotic contact, but the idea was erotic contact had to be free from fear of pregnancy as well as from fear of disease. Right? And erotic contact would be, pregnancy is very important, it's very powerful. One has to be very careful to produce children in the world. There was, for example, a conference a population conference in 1996 in Cairo, in Egypt, in which all the churches, all the representatives of different religiosities were present, and what was discussed was how to contain the population growth, and that of course has to do with Eros, and all the churches and all the religious movements completely rejected any kind of change in the erotic constitution, the erotic regimes that they had evolved. There was in order, however, a regular, how shall I say, there was a secular movement in that thing that tried to find a way, and in the way of Margaret Mead, coming of age in Samoa. Now, just as a conclusion, I just want to say, Margaret Mead was vilified terribly in the United States. She was accused of falsifying her data, of doing all kinds of bad things that an anthropologist is not supposed to do. But Bill Clinton gave her the Presidential Medal of Freedom 2 years after her death. I will conclude with this.
Okay, thank you, Horst.
You're very welcome.